Hello, I'm Nick Kitchen. I'm an executive coach and a facilitator and a consultant working with largely multinational organisations at leadership level and elsewhere, helping them facilitate organisational change, which is not easy. It's one of the most challenging things you can do in the world of business. However, because of phenomenal changes that we're all aware of out there, and they're changing as we speak, even from the moment as I'm saying this, something will be shifting out there. If you intend to survive in going forward and being distinct, then you need to embrace change. The notion of staying the same, both at a human level and organisational level, isn't really an option. So the outcomes from this brief presentation is to identify the stages of the change process and to say something about practically applying the change process in managing organisational change. The theory is great, the practice can be the Wild West. Change management's history, well, it's been around for quite a long time. Kurt Lewin was one of the earlier people who started to write about that. His notion was unfreezing, making the change and refreezing. Can't really understand organisational change without understanding how humans respond to change and how groups of humans respond to change. So in terms of facilitating change, you need to match your approach to the type of change. These days, lots of people talk about change, and there's lots of talk about being transformational and exciting change, and it doesn't always have to be that. Sometimes it can be simply a transactional change, just changing in some of the ways we do business. Transitional change could be even transitioning from working locally to working more in the periphery. However, for a growing number of companies, I think, they're facing the challenge of transformational change, which is really looking at the fundamental business model and the ways of relating that you have in the organisation, and maybe looking at how best to fit them differently for the current environment. So what are the stages of the change process? Well, there are a variety of models, and here's a reasonably obvious 7-step approach, basic one. I think fundamentally, unless you have, number one, leadership commitment to communication, then don't bother. If the leadership isn't role modelling what the change is like, if they're not committed to it and look deep into themselves and recognise what is it I have to change in myself, as well as supporting other people, then the chances of it being successful change, and certainly transformational change, are limited. You need to define very clearly the business results and the destination. So part of that is the results, but part of that, and particularly this is a leadership challenge, to really bring to life what the future looks like, to create that tension between what a possible future can be and how attractive that can be and where you currently are, and to keep revisiting that as well. Identify the current state, so really look at, in truth, about where you are now. Probably also, and where you're going to be if you carry on simply working the way you are, with the current mores and values and ways of working. Then you build creative tension between the two. So that's that slightly exciting, nervy period when you're moving from, or really starting to engage in moving from one place. You're not at the new one yet, and you're considering the transitioning process. You design that change, so you create the creative tension, you design the steps to the new way of working. You implement that change, and then, of course, somehow sustain the change and embed it in the organisation. So if we look at that as a schematic, and I quite like this schematic because you've got your destination and you have your current state, and project managers and many people in business would love this to be a nice, easy 7-step process. 1 follows 2, follows 3, follows 4, and then you get there. The fact is, it probably is more of a vortex, as this suggests. It can be 2 steps forward, 1 step back. In working with so many organisations, I have to deal with people saying, well, if anything, this is messier than it was before. Change is messy. Change gets messy. And you have to be able to be comfortable working at times with people and in that mess. How are you, if you're working in change, with managing ambiguity and lack of clarity? Let's look at some of these in greater detail then. So, leadership, commitment and communication. Communication, great word, key word. You have to double or treble the amount of communication you do around this, and it'll be heard less and less as people go through the change, as anxiety starts to kick in about what the new future might hold. So the leadership provides the trust, and again, that is often by them walking their talk, genuinely engaging with people in groups and providing direction and building that alignment around the change. It says here, managing complexity and contradictions. That's very easy to write, pretty easy to say, very hard to do. So again, if I'm speaking to any leaders here, future leaders, or indeed if you're with organisations, you work with leaders, the leader really has to be able to hold competing views and ambiguity and complexity really comfortably. This is right, but that's also right. This silo has a view and, it looks like this, and this silo of the organisation has another one. Both can be right. How can you start to, manage the collaboration around there? Also, at what point do you really firm up and say, these are the absolute baselines? This is a given. This is the area that's debatable and negotiable. Let's engage genuinely and authentically with that area, with my people. And hence involve the people with the change. Reward and recognise people who are starting to step into the future or help craft the future. Energise the change. It takes energy to do this. Either make sure you're energising people around you who are doing that, but to go on there and regularly keep revisiting what it is you're trying to achieve, why it is you're moving in this direction. Make sure people have adequate resources. Resources often get thin or at least inappropriately spread during a change process, and provide support. So, define the business results and the destination. And a focus on clearly identified goals provides a sense of community. Well, that's true. Sometimes you're not entirely sure what the goals are, and sometimes the territory is tricky. But where you can, putting some clear benchmarks in is very important. And being cognizant of the fact that for many, many people, most people, what gets measured is what gets managed, is what gets done. So as you're thinking about the new change, and for example, how people are rewarded and how people are motivated, clearly those processes must be aligned towards the new future. We talked about identifying the current state. This can be a real sort of revealing session. What's the reality about where we are currently? And probably even to run with various people in some groups. And were we to carry on like this, what sort of future are we facing? So, Nokia back in the 70s was a distributed industrial conglomerate in a variety of different things, but they realised that actually, were they to carry on like that, then they'd have increasingly a smaller and smaller, less impactful future. And one of their divisions was in mobile phones. And the then CEO recognised that actually the future was hugely in mobile phones, and so built that creative tension whilst running what would happen with the current state. Well, we're possibly not going to survive, and here's this very exciting future by really changing the organisation totally and embracing mobile phones. So, build creative tension, and you start to identify, so what and who enables the change, and what and who are barriers. Key things to consider: making sure that enough people have been informed and touched around the need for change, the level of change sponsorship. So, identify your change champions. Who are your exemplars? The best thing, the easiest thing to do is find people who look like the future and who can communicate well, and start to engage them and start to put them in front of people. What's the investment required, and what are the current market conditions? Both the current market conditions and projected market conditions. The whole thing, as ever, is you're building an organisation fit for today and the future. So what shifts can you discern in the marketplace? You will be dealing hugely with emotions and feelings of various groups in the organisation who are impacted by the change. If it's a transformational change, that means everyone. So you will be dealing with levels of resistance and people's notions of identity at this point. So, a working knowledge of some psychology and an understanding of group processes around this is quite handy, really. If we look at some classic sources of resistance, so, why is it that people might be resistant to change? Why is it, for the most part, we don't really like change? One is habit. We build habits really powerfully as individuals and as organisations. And we tend to get wedded to our habits. In fact, it's almost said we are more wedded to our habits at times than even staying alive. We will carry on doing these things, even if the writing is on the wall, and quite clearly it's either bad for our health personally or bad for our health organisationally as well. So habits are very powerful. A sense of security. We build our sense of security as individuals in an organisation on all sorts of things. I do my job, I turn up, I do my 5-6 days a week. I'm familiar with my surroundings and my people and my pay packet. The future could be quite a scary place. Obviously, economic factors can be a source of resistance. So it may well be that change involves one area having to be cut back, of course, and that can be very challenging. we all have pretty much a fear of the unknown. And so why on earth would I follow you into something that's unknown when this is known and, okay, it's a bit slower than it might be, but actually I'm familiar with this. So the fear of the unknown is a challenge for all of us. And as we start to engage with our fears around change and loss of ego and identity, then our senses start to sort of narrow. Our ability to hear starts to narrow. Our ability to see clearly starts to narrow. So, a leader could give a speech about 20 wonderful things and mention one tiny thing that could be problematic, and you know which one that people will hear and sort of respond to. And so a notion of selective information processing. This says, by the way, as we communicate, you tell people, you tell them again, you listen, you keep going through that cycle, until you get bored of it, probably. So, other sources of resistance. Organisational resistance, limited focus of change. Recognising that all organisations act highly systemically, by which I mean that if you tap here, there are ripples that run throughout the whole organisation, and being mindful of all the sort of ripples that run through the organisation from any change. A classic might be that people, finance think, well, we can outsource a back office, for example. So they outsource a back office. The ripples and effects and consequences from that change can go through the whole organisation. There will be a lag and delay in that. It may well take a while to come through, but that can affect the whole organisation. So really have an understanding of the complexity of organisations, and that if you change any one piece, you may well be affecting the other piece. That's particularly true in matrix organisations. Group inertia. We, as groups and organisations, and particularly with structures that might not be quite aligned to the change, we have invested a lot of energy in the current state, and therefore there's quite a lot of inertia. It's rather like moving a rocket to the moon. You have to achieve a thing called critical velocity. So it goes round and round to get beyond the gravity, which is the inertia of the current state, and throw itself out into space. And that takes a lot of energy, a lot of effort. There can be threats to individuals and the organisation to establish power relationships. A particular challenge to CEOs who've gone up through the organisation is probably the reason they've worked up through the organisation is because they have developed relationships with a whole variety of people that are now in place. And the change may well be a threat to some of those relationships. So it asks a lot of that leader to then see beyond that and to create a new space, because the leader is also part of the old system. And a threat to establish resource allocation. So sales used to get a huge chunk of that, and increasingly we're moving into collaboration and JVs, joint ventures. Maybe they'll be threatened by that. And the implementation of the change. So we involve the key stakeholders. We understand levels of commitment and compliance we're dealing with from people. And let's just pause and think about how people might respond to change. So we've talked about some generalities. You're probably going to experience and recognise the next 5 groups. So you'll get some people very aligned to the change, and then you'll get some people who nod and say, I agree with it, and they're lying. And then you get some who actively campaign against the change. And in terms of moving forward and sustaining the change, as the change kicks in, again, recognise that this is at the moment as a newborn baby of a company. The people who are manifesting the way the world and the organisation should be working now should regularly be noticed and their examples spread around. So, in summary, current state to destination, organisational change is messy, it's never longitudinal and sequential, you have to stick with it, but it's hugely worth it because you can create an organisation that can go on to and do amazing things.